Sometimes we don't realize what we signed up for until it's too late to do anything about it. Happily married and beginning his adult life in North Carolina, Mr. Fidler never thought he would be pulled back into the world of warfare, especially so quickly after being released from it. But he had been in the reserves, and the government was taking anyone they could get their hands on to combat a growing threat in Korea. Mr. Fidler did not shy away from the call of duty, even though he did not particularly want to leave. But he did cope with the news and selflessly left his new bride to serve his country yet again. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ping Jockey podcast. I'm Marley, the co-host, and I'm sitting here with the Ping Jockey himself, Mr. Kenneth H. Fidler. What were your plans now that you received this news?
Well, as soon as I received my notice to go back in the Navy, Betty and I had a few long talks about what we wanted to do as far as our planning for the future. She wanted to try to become pregnant and have a child, even with the possibility that there was a chance I wouldn't come back. She said at least she would have a part of me then. We did decide to take that path, even though there were not a lot of opportunities to do anything about it. I stayed at the Philadelphia Navy Yard a little over 2 weeks, and in that time Betty came to visit at the base whenever she was allowed. Right before I got my orders to leave Philadelphia, I was able to go home to Chester overnight, maybe 2 or 3 times.
So was that a common practice for people who were drafted to try to have a child with their significant other before leaving?
I think I've heard of that. That was our idea anyway.
Yeah. So what happened next when you left?
Well, I found out after I was there a little while, and I found out we were leaving for San Francisco the next day by train. I don't think I was able to see Betty again before we left, though. I was, however, able to talk to her on the phone and to tell her when we were leaving the Philadelphia station. She said she would be sitting on the hood of our car at the railroad crossing in Chester, as we might catch a glimpse of each other. She told me she would be wearing a bright red dress with Butch at her side. The troop train left the Philadelphia station loaded with sailors. It was late morning, September 21st. As we approached Chester, I started to look for Betty and Butch. Sure enough, as the train passed where she said she would be, I saw the car parked along the side of the tracks, with Betty sitting on the hood with Butch, and she was waving. And of course, a few thousand sailors were waving back at her. She told me later that there were so many sailors that she just started waving at the train and got there and kept waving until it was past. I guess she never did actually see me.
So then what happened?
Well, then the train consisted of Pullman cars and a couple dining cars, and we all had beds to sleep in at night, so that made the trip more enjoyable. After Chester, we went through Baltimore, Washington, West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and then Missouri on the BS Railroad. Traveling across the country was nice most of the time, but when every mile takes your farther away from home and the one you love, it doesn't feel so good. It put a bad feeling in your stomach knowing that you probably won't be home again for a long time. If ever, I guess that was an all-time low in my life, but fortunately, I was able to see through and keep looking forward to the time that I would be coming home again.
Did you stop in any interesting cities on your way out to San Francisco?
Yeah, in St. Louis we changed to the Missouri and Pacific Railroad, although we kept the same Pullman cars the whole trip. This took a lot of moving cars around in the railroad yards, and they said it would take some time, so they told us we could get off the train and go into town for a little while. I believe they gave us an hour or so. The station seemed to be right in downtown St. Louis, so some of us took off and walked uptown. We eventually stopped at a bar to have a drink, and while we were there we met 3 nice young couples. They were very friendly and asked us where we were going, and we told them that we were waiting for our train to be made up, and they left and said they would come down to the station to wave a goodbye. We stayed at the bar a little longer until we realized we had to hurry so that we didn't miss our train. As we were running through the station, all of a sudden we heard someone yelling, "Goodbye!" We looked around and saw the 3 couples we had met earlier. They actually did come down to the station to wave goodbye. We didn't have time to stop and talk, but we waved to them and we were getting on the train. It probably was just the uniform we had on, but it gave us a good feeling to know somebody cared about us a bit when we were so far from home.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
So what happened when you guys finally got to San Francisco?
Tuesday, September 26, 1950, we arrived in San Francisco early in the morning. We were taken out to the naval base on Treasure Island and set up in barracks. We got another physical, dental examination, and bag inspection, and were scheduled for the Admiral's inspection the next day. They announced that anyone who gave a pint of blood would be exempt from the Admiral's inspection and would get a weekend liberty. They got so many volunteers that I decided to keep my blood a little long. The best part of my day was that I got 2 letters from Betty. They were the first letters since I left Philadelphia. In her letter, she said she was late with her period, so we kept our fingers crossed. I called my cousin, Walter Herner, who lived in San Mateo, and he invited me to their house. He and his wife, Ruth, and 2 children, and his father, William, my uncle, all lived in a house in San Mateo, 20 miles south of San Francisco. He told me how to get there, and I went, and it was good to see my uncle again. I hadn't seen any of them since World War II. I enjoyed a nice visit, and they invited me to come back on Sunday for a turkey dinner, and he promised to show me around a little bit.
All right, so you had family out in San Francisco, so that was nice.
Yeah.
So then what happened next?
Oh, on Saturday, September 30th, they posted another draft list, and I was on it. We were to fly out the next evening, and I was assigned to the USS Mansfield Destroyer 728. I found out that it was off of the western coast of Korea in the invasion of Incheon. As soon as I got a chance, I called my cousin and let him know that I wouldn't be able to make the Sunday dinner. I was really disappointed. On Sunday, October 1st, we flew out of the Moffett Air Base at 2215 on a big 4-engine marine transport plane. That was the first time I had ever flown, and I wasn't very happy to be leaving late at night in the dark, heading out over the Pacific Ocean. On top of that, we were seated in one long row down side, each side of the plane, facing each other on a piece of canvas stretched over 3 metal rods for seats. In the center of the plane were a couple of big spare engines strapped onto the deck. To top it all off, they give us life jackets with ditching instructions in case we had to land in the ocean.
Ooh, that's a little unnerving.
Whoopee.
So, it was a 12-hour flight. You guys finally landed in Honolulu, Hawaii. And then what happened next?
We stayed at an airfield about 30 miles from Honolulu and were told that we were definitely going to Japan. It was nice and warm in Hawaii, even though the trip over was cold. We flew at 9,000 feet, and the plane wasn't heated much. We all wore our pea coats, but our legs froze. We stayed for 2 or 3 days before we had priority. When anyone with number 1 priority flew out the same day. When we got on, I had met a fellow in the Navy, and his wife was pregnant, and he had 3 children, and they were expecting another one any day. Well, when we got off the plane, they told him she had a baby and he could go home. He was a very happy man.
Oh, I'm sure. Didn't even have to leave the country. Where were you guys headed this time?
Well, our first stop, after we took off, was on Thursday, October 5th. I was on my way again. They posted the list and I was on it. Bob Hope and his troop arrived that day for a show for the servicemen, and we missed it. He was on his way to Korea and Japan, so we hoped we would get a chance to see them later. We took off at 2000, and at midnight we landed on a tiny little island called Johnson Island. It was so small that when we landed, the wheels on the plane touched the water, and then we stopped at the end of the runway, and the wheels were in the water again. When we taxied up to the hangar, a sign read, "Welcome to Johnson Island. 234 people and 3 dogs." We ate a hot meal and took off again in about an hour. And then we were on to Kwajalein. On the way to Kwajalein, we smelled gasoline, but they couldn't seem to find a leak. So they told everyone not to smoke cigarettes until we landed. It was about an 8-hour flight, and we arrived there about 8 o'clock Saturday morning. We only had 4 hours of Friday, and then we crossed the international date line, and it became Saturday. We got off the plane, and they took us to the mess hall for breakfast. The mechanics continued to look for the gas leak, while some of the people in the mess hall told us about the plane of the Navy nurses that crashed that last week. They said that when the plane of nurses arrived a week ago, they complained of smelling gasoline, and they thought that they might have a gas leak. They never found it, and they took off. As they leveled out at 9,000 feet, it blew up, and all 40 nurses were killed. Well, that sure made us feel good.
Oh, man.
And it seemed as if we had the same problem. We stayed there an hour and a half to have breakfast. Up to that time, they hadn't found a gas leak. So we took off and headed for Guam.
And you guys made it?
And it was another 8-hour flight, and as we approached Guam, our one engine started to throw oil, and it started to smoke. We made an emergency landing with all the fire trucks there and everything, but we landed safely. We stayed there all day while they worked on the engine. About 11 o'clock that night, they decided that it was probably safe to take off. We took off that and headed for Tokyo, Japan. We arrived in Tokyo on Sunday, October 8th.
That's
our first wedding anniversary.
Oh, wow. How did you end up spending your first wedding anniversary?
Well, it really wasn't fun, but after 40 hours of flying, we finally made it to Japan. I figured since I left Philadelphia, I was at least 10,000 miles from home. We landed at the Haneda airfield at 0700. Then a bus took us from an airport to the Navy Reserve Station in Yokosuka, Japan. That was a good half hour from Tokyo. It was formerly the Japanese Yokosuka Navy base. We checked into a barracks, ate breakfast, and then after having to do exactly nothing all morning, we had dinner. When we went into the mess hall, everything was already placed on the table, family style. We just had to sit down and start eating. If we ran out of anything, there was always a Japanese waiter standing by to fill the dish. After dinner, I was able to get a haircut from a Japanese barber and also a shoe shine, all for free.
Wow.
We didn't stay very long, and by 5 o'clock that evening, we left for the railroad station to take the train to Sasebo, Japan. And it was a 36-hour ride.
My goodness.
And at Sasebo, Japan is when we were supposed to pick up the USS Mansfield. On Tuesday, October 10th, our train arrived in Sasebo, Japan early in the morning. I reported aboard the USS Mansfield about 0900, and she had recently arrived in Sasebo. She had been in the Incheon invasion when she hit a mine, had about 30 casualties, and was pretty banged up. She had most of her bow blown off, and with all of this damage, there wasn't enough room for all the crew to sleep. Some of us temporarily moved over to the USS Dixie until repairs were made. The Mansfield expected to be in Sasebo 3 or 4 weeks for repairs, and then she was going back to the United States for a complete overhaul. I thought it'd be great if I could go along back with them. But of course, that was wishful thinking. There already is a rumor that about 70 men of the crew were going to be transferred before we left.
So while all of this was happening to you, what was going on at home with your family?
My brother Ray went to school at Albright College with a fellow by the name of Bob Harper. He was called back in the Navy about the time that I was about. Was evidently was assigned to the USS Dixie. He and 40 other fellows reported aboard. They came across the Pacific by ship instead of flying, so it took them a little longer. I got a chance to talk to him. It sure felt good to talk to someone from Reading again.
And then you ended up getting a letter from someone else with some very special news.
And then I received a letter from my mother, but still hadn't received a letter from Betty since I got out here. It took my mother's letter 8 days to arrive by airmail, so I guess the mail was a little slow. My mother mentioned, though, that Bill Morris was called back into the Navy, and he had to report on October 16th. I felt sorry for him.
And what about the good news on October 17th?
I finally got 3 letters from Betty, another from my mother, and one from my brother. They were great. According to Betty's letters, it looks like as if we were going to have a family. The doctor said the baby was due about June 4th. I hoped I could get home by then.
Wow, that's something to really get you through to the end of...
They figured that pretty close.
Yeah, they got her birthday just about spot on.
Yeah.
And good news to get you through the trying times that were about to unfold.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is where we leave our listeners, and we're concluding the 14th episode of the Ping Jockey podcast. I'm Marley, and I'm here with the Ping Jockey.
Bye-bye.